So Malcolm, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope none of you have come here expecting to find to listen to Doug. If so, I'm very sorry. You're going to have to put up with me, and I hope I am an able substitute. Right. So yes, I have flown in a Spitfire. The war was over by then, by the way. But yeah, it was about 3 years ago. But it was the fulfillment of a dream that I'd had since the age of 10. That's when my father took me to St. Athan. I used to do a Battle of Britain air display every year. And that's when I first saw a Spitfire, and it was love at first sight. I thought, what a beautiful aircraft. And it was weaving and diving around the sky. And it wasn't only the sight of it, it was the sound as well. The engine, it's the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and it has a lovely sound and very instantly recognizable. I remember one day last summer, it was lunchtime, and I was sitting having my lunch. The back door was open, and I suddenly heard this sound in the sky of an aircraft, and I thought, that's a Merlin. And I dashed out, and sure enough, there was a Spitfire flying over on its way to the Swansea Air Show, which I'd forgotten all about and didn't get to see, unfortunately. So yes, it was the fulfillment of a dream. And 2.5 years ago, I did actually get to, I did actually get to fly in a Spitfire, and I'm going to tell you about that. But first of all, I want to give you a brief history of this amazing aircraft. Oops. Right, so we need to go back to the late 1920s, and this aircraft is called the Supermarine S6B. Not the most exciting of names, but it was a fantastic aircraft, and it was built for one purpose only, which was to win the Schneider Trophy. This was an international air race for seaplanes. And the S6B won the trophy not once but 3 times, in 1928, 1929, and 1931. And having won it 3 times, the company kept the trophy then forever. It was revolutionary in design. First of all, it was a monoplane, so it had one set of wings. It's not a biplane, which most planes were in those days. Also, it was all metal, whereas most planes were built of wood and canvas. It had an enclosed cockpit for the pilot, and despite having to carry these great heavy floats so it could land in the water, it was incredibly fast. It broke the world speed record of 407 miles an hour. Doesn't sound much these days, but in those days, that was a phenomenal speed. So, job done. It had won the Schneider Trophy, but in 1931, there were some worrying things happening in Germany. The Nazis hadn't yet come to power, but they were not far off, and it came to light that the Germans had been secretly developing military aircraft during the 1920s, which they'd been forbidden to do when they signed the Versailles Treaty at the end of the First World War. And they were pretending that these aircraft were sporting aircraft. And here's one that was in the early stage of development, the ME-109. Now, it's just like the S6B, it's a monoplane, it's all metal construction, enclosed cockpit. It has retractable undercarriage. The wheels folded up into the wings, so that made it faster. But they were pretending that this was a sporting aircraft. It's badged in civilian markings. It's got the international civil aviation registration, which is still used today. So the D for Deutschland, country of registration, and then the 4 letters that are unique to that aircraft. We still use that today. For a British plane, it's G for Great Britain, and then the four letters. It's got the swastika on the tail. That's because the Messerschmitt company was supporting the Nazis, as were many other businesses in Germany at the time, because the Nazis were dealing with the communists who were causing all sorts of trouble in factories. and they were dealing with them mainly by breaking their heads in street fights. But the businessmen were not worried about that. Obviously, once this was equipped with a set of machine guns, it became a fighter, and one of the best fighters of the Second World War. Now, the RAF had not been developing military aircraft because they believed that the First World War was the war to end wars, so there was no point spending money on developing aircraft. And that was typical of the sort of planes they were flying in the 1930s, the Hawker Hart. And if you look at it, it's not much advanced from a First World War plane. So it's a biplane, it's got two sets of wings, it's got fixed wheels, open cockpit, and it's made of the traditional wood and canvas, not metal. Top speed, 174 miles an hour. So you can imagine if that had been up against the Messerschmitt in the Battle of Britain, the battle would have been over in about 10 minutes. So the government woke up to the threat that was being posed by what was going on in Germany, and they issued a tender for a fast monoplane fighter. And so, So the designer of the S6B, a brilliant engineer called Reginald Mitchell, got his team together and said, right, let's see what we can use, what we've learned with the S6B and create a fighter. And the result was the Spitfire, which first flew in 1934. Contract was awarded for 310 Spitfires. Now, why 310 and not 300 or 350? I don't know. So it matched the Me-109 for speed, and when it was equipped with 8 machine guns, it was a pretty formidable fighter. But production was slow for various reasons. They had labor troubles, they had supply problems, technical problems, and by September 1939, when the Second World War broke out, there were just 9 squadrons. That's 12 to a squadron, so it's 108 Spitfires. Now, one of the reasons why it was so successful, oh, by the way, I should have mentioned Reginald Mitchell, so the creator of the Spitfire, the brilliant engineer, sadly died in 1937, so never saw his brilliant aircraft and the role it played in the Second World War. He didn't like the name Spitfire, by the way. The name was dreamed up by the Air Ministry, and he said, that's just the sort of damn stupid names they would give. But I think Spitfire is perfect. It spat fire at the enemy, and they ran off. Now, one of the problems with the Spitfire, however, was due to the engine. Now, it had a brilliant engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. I mentioned earlier how nice it sounded, but obviously that wasn't the engineer's priority. But it was a very, very good engine. It was so good, in fact, it powered the Hurricane, the Mosquito, the Lancaster bomber, the American P-51. It was a superb engine. It was 1,150 horsepower. To put that into perspective, the average British saloon car at the time would be the Austin 10 horsepower. This was the power of 1,150 horses, so that was pretty powerful. Top speed, 350 miles an hour, but there was one serious problem with it, and that is that when you put the plane into a steep dive, the carburetor would flood and the engine would stop. I don't want to get too technical there, but for those who know about engines, the carburetor feeds the petrol to the cylinders, and if the carburetor floods, then the engine stops. Now, this meant that if they were chasing a Messerschmitt, it went into a dive, you dived after it, your engine stopped. Pretty annoying. It was dangerous if the plane was chasing you when you went into a dive and your engine stopped. And of course, the Germans knew this because their engines didn't have this problem. They had fuel injection in their engines. So, of course, as soon as the Spitfire was chasing you, go into a steep dive and you lost it. So they set their minds to this, All the experts at Rolls-Royce scratched their heads and thought, how can we solve this? But the person who came up with a solution was one of those rare creatures, a female engineer. Beatrice Schilling, Tilly Schilling as she was called. She'd been a racing motorcyclist before the war, had set a speed record at Brooklands, the famous racing circuit. And her solution was very, very simple. She inserted a little metal ring into the carburetor, and that meant it stopped from flooding. And the pilots were delighted about this, but not very respectful towards her, because they referred to this little item as Miss Schilling's orifice. Yeah, a bit naughty, yeah. Now, so we come to July 1940, and the beginning of what Winston Churchill called the Battle of Britain. Now, we had not one, but two outstandingly good aircraft. One was the Spitfire, the other was the Hurricane, which never gets the credit it deserves. It's always the Spitfire was the glamorous one. It was the sexy plane. And the Hurricane was rather chunky, but a superb plane, very tough. It took a lot to get it to shoot it down, and it was quickly and easily repaired. It was a marvelous aeroplane in many ways, but it never gets the glory of the Spitfire. One pilot who flew both types said the Hurricane was like a bulldog and the Spitfire was like a greyhound. So when they were tackling fleets of German aircraft, the Hurricane would go after the bombers and the Spitfire would deal with the fighters. And actually, the Hurricane shot down more enemy aircraft in the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire, although that is partly because there were more of them. So we get to the summer of 1940. By this time, all of Europe is under German control. Britain was next on the list, but inconveniently for Hitler, the English Channel was in the way. So he would have to send his army across in barges, because it didn't have landing craft, send his army across in barges, and he knew that the RAF would have to be completely destroyed, otherwise they would massacre the Germans before they were halfway across the Channel. So the strategy was to send huge fleets of bombers over, escorted by fleets of fighters, to draw our planes up into the air and shoot them down. Now, at the start of the battle, the RAF had 749 aircraft. The Germans had 2,550. So it was a bit uneven. Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, said, oh, no problem. We'll have the RAF out of business in 2 to 4 weeks. Well, the Battle of Britain went on began in the middle of July. At the beginning of July, it went on to the middle of September of 1940. And it looked pretty hopeless for us, vastly outnumbered. But we did have one very important weapon. We had radar, very, very new at the time. And so there'd be a string of these masts all up and down the East Coast. And they could detect oncoming aircraft while they were still quite a long way off. And the information then would be sent to the Fighter Command headquarters. And these women here, these are all WAFs, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and they would have these long rakes. They were standing over a huge map of the English Channel, and they would draw these little blocks across, each representing a fleet of aircraft, and then the fighter controllers up there could direct our fighters to intercept them. Now here we see a group of pilots waiting to be scrambled, sitting in the sunshine. It was a lovely summer, 1940, which was bad luck for us because we could have done with a more traditional British summer of rain and wind and so on. But it was lovely sunshine day after day, and they looked very relaxed and so on. But any minute now, the call to scramble would send them running towards their aircraft. They're wearing what they're wearing here. These yellow things are what they call Mae Wests, which is flotation devices in case they got shot down in the water, so they wouldn't drown. Named after Mae West, the famous American actress, and who had a fine pair of flotation devices herself, and so that was in honor of her. So here we see the pilots. They've got the call to scramble. They're running towards the aircraft. The ground crews have got them started up running, and they jump in, strap themselves in, and within 3 or 4 minutes, they'd be up in the air waiting to intercept the Germans. This was a bit disconcerting for the Germans. They've never experienced this before, to have the enemy up and waiting for them. Plus the fact they were now facing 2 of the most formidable aircraft they'd ever encountered. Nevertheless, the odds were stacked against the RAF, and for the pilots, the few, as Winston Churchill called them, in that famous line, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." The strain of going up day after day, 3 or 4 or 5 sorties a day, to meet the enemy, placed great strain, physical and psychological. The psychological strain of aerial combat, very intense, and they had to be constantly looking in the mirror to make sure they weren't being jumped from a plane behind them. And the physical strain of doing all this weaving and diving and looping placed great G-forces on their bodies. And although they were all young men in the peak of fitness, all in the sort of 18 to 25 age group, nevertheless, fatigue set in, and as they got tired, they got careless, and they got shot down. And we were, as the weeks went by, we were losing more and more aircraft and pilots. Well, the aircraft could be replaced. We had a good system of replacing the aircraft, but you couldn't replace the pilots because a fighter pilot needed at least 200 hours of training, and they didn't have 200 hours. They were sending young men with just 20 hours, and it was nowhere near enough. It'd be like teaching someone to drive a car and then saying, right, now we're going to go to Brands Hatch and we're going to put you in a Formula 1 racing car and you're going to race around at 200 miles an hour. And by the way, there'll be people firing at you at the same time. So the situation was getting quite desperate. And the pilots were not all British. They came from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, Canada. There was even a squadron of American pilots, even though America wasn't in the war at the time. And there were also pilots coming from Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Belgium, the countries that had been overrun by the Germans, and they got out just in time. And of those, the Poles were the most ferocious pilots. They absolutely hated the Germans, and they would go in really close and make sure they killed the pilot, not only shot down the aircraft. However, it got to the middle of September of 1940. The RAF still hadn't been destroyed. The pilots were saying, well, we were told that the RAF was finished, and yet they're still coming. How are they doing it? But as I say, it got to mid-September, and Hitler knew it was too late now to mount an invasion. So he postponed it till the next spring. But the next spring, he turned his attention on the big prize, which was Russia. So the Battle of Britain ended, the score, England 1, Germany 0. Oh dear, sorry. I keep pressing the wrong bit. Right. You'll recognise the man on the right, Winston Churchill. On the left is Lord Beaverbrook, a very controversial figure, a Canadian newspaper millionaire, but a very abrasive character, but he got things done. And that's why Churchill appointed him. Although he wasn't a politician, but Churchill made him Minister of Aircraft Production. And when the main Spitfire factory in Southampton was bombed, he came up with the idea of creating lots of mini factories. So he requisitioned cinemas, warehouses, garages, any large building, and each of these built one, they made one part. So one would make all the wings, one would make all the fuselages, and so on. And then they'd all be taken to a secret assembly point and put together. So the Germans couldn't bomb them because they didn't know where they were. And by 1942, they had 250 of these mini factories all over the south of England. In addition, there was the main factory at Castle Bromwich, and altogether they built 22,000 Spitfires throughout the war. Now, the job of ferrying the aircraft from the factories to the frontline stations was carried out by a civilian organization called the Air Transport Auxiliary. And this was made up of experienced pilots who were too old to fly in combat. But after a while, they were persuaded to take on women as well, because there were lots of women, qualified, experienced pilots. And so rather reluctantly, the RAF weren't too happy about women flying their precious aeroplanes, but they reluctantly agreed to it. And eventually 10% of the ATA were women. Of course, although the RAF agreed to let them fly, to be ferry pilots, but there was absolutely no way they were ever going to be allowed to fly in combat, which was a shame, because the Russians formed a squadron of female fighter pilots, and that wasn't some sort of nod towards equality. They were desperate. They'd lost so many of their pilots, and there were hundreds of women in Russia who could fly, so they let them form a fighter squadron, and surprise, surprise, they were very good. They were some of them better than the men. They shot down more planes than the men, which didn't go down too well, but yeah, so it worked. And I've often thought, if the RAF had allowed women to experienced female pilots to fly, then it would have saved those young men, the inexperienced young men who got shot down almost on the first mission. That would have been avoided. However, no, women were allowed to fly as ferry pilots, and that was it. And they had to fly any type of aircraft, from a Spitfire to a Lancaster bomber, and very often they'd be flying on their own. No navigator, no radio operator. They'd have to take these aircraft and deliver them safely to wherever, and it could have been up in Scotland, you know. So they were brilliant. And sometimes a bomber would land at a station and out would get the pilot, but the ground crew would say, "Well, where's the pilot?" "I'm the pilot." "What? You can't be the pilot." There was one case where they even searched the aircraft. He didn't believe that this woman had flown the aircraft, and so they were brilliant. And the picture on the left is the front cover of a book by Mary Ellis. She was one of the ferry pilots, and I'm going to just read a little excerpt from her book, where she describes the joy of flying a Spitfire for the first time. That's the plane they all wanted to fly, was the Spitfire. And she said, "I am flying my first Spitfire, really and truly. I fly away from the airfield at around 150 miles an hour to the delight of an enthusiastic ground crew waving in celebration of my successful takeoff. I listen to the thumping hum of a happy Merlin flexing its power in the sky where it belonged. But while my heart was completely fulfilled, my mind was busy in the cockpit of the fastest, most beautiful fighter in the world, as I was responsible for its safe journey to the RAF pilots who needed it. I must confess, the moment I had surged along the runway and felt the tail lift effortlessly off the ground, any small nagging fears about flying the Spitfire had disappeared. It was a wonderful experience, the power, the speed, and easy controllability. All of these aspects of the Spitfire were tremendously thrilling to me." Now, she goes on to say what they did in their off-duty hours, and it sounds as though their off-duty time was as thrilling as flying the Spitfire. She said, "There was a general feeling about during the war, among us doing our bit, that it wasn't helpful to the spirit or the confidence to acknowledge too much death, as we were all striving to survive and put danger out of our minds. There was this inexplicable pressure to live our lives to the maximum. There was an attitude, especially among young men, about getting your jollies while you could, and the sight of a young woman flying the sexiest icon going, the Spitfire, then that was something to be enjoyed, absolutely. one might not get the chance again if the enemy arrived on our shores. And I think we know what getting the jollies was all about. So, and yes, I mean, you look at that picture and you see they were a civilian organization, but they had a uniform very similar to the RAF's, darker blue. And you can imagine young women with these smart uniforms and wings on the chest would be quite a draw for the young men. Now, yes, I say 10% of the ATA were women, but they got about 100% of the publicity. So much so because people thought that it was an all-female organization. And during the war, the ATA ferried 309,000 aircraft, 147 different types. And as I say, all they had when they got a new aircraft was a little book called the Pilot's Notes, and from that they had to learn how to fly that aircraft. It was phenomenally brilliant. It was quite brilliant. Now, I mentioned Lord Beaverbrook. Another of his bright ideas was a way of raising money, because the war was costing the country £1 million a day. That's £1 million in those days. So he came up with this idea of what we would now call crowdfunding. It was called Buy a Spitfire. And the message was, raise £5,000 and we'll put the name of your town and city on the fuselage of the Spitfire. And this was taken up with huge enthusiasm by the British public, because by then the Spitfire had become the saviour of the country. Never mind the poor old Hurricane, the Spitfire was the glory girl. And it became the poster boy for this project. And every part, there were 7,000 parts that went into a Spitfire. Every part was given a price. So 8 shillings bought a spark plug, £40 bought a petrol tank, and so on. So you could raise a small amount of money and still know what it was being spent on. Of course, the money didn't just go to buy Spitfires. It went into the general exchequer to keep the war going. And I've got some very rather touching little children's stories, because they were caught up in it as well. Here's a couple. 12-year-old John Masters told the BBC Home Service that he'd already raised £4.10 to build Spitfires. He said, we lived for 7 years in East Africa. I've got quite a lot of interesting things we'd brought back home there. I held an exhibition of them in a tent in our garden and charged people a penny to come in. Then a man who sold poultry gave me a dozen eggs, and I raffled them at 6p each. 8-year-old Patricia Bonsey had a particularly cunning plan. She sent 15 shillings to the Ministry of Aircraft Production with an explanation that when my mummy has to take me out and I have wanted to use a public convenience, she had to pay a penny. So I thought if I did the same at home, it would help your fund. So everyone in her house, when they went to the loo, had to literally spend a penny. And up and down the country, people were holding dances and concerts and raffles and jumble sales and so on. And huge amounts of money came in to the exchequer, but the Spitfire was the poster boy for this. So the Spitfire was in continuous development all through the war. In fact, it was constantly being updated and modified. And the one on the left there, that's the Mark 24, which is also the one on my T-shirt. And you'll notice that the nose is quite a bit longer on that one than the earlier one. Where's it gone? There we are. And that's because it was no longer using the Merlin engine. The Merlin had reached the limit of its development. And this was an even bigger beast. It was called the Rolls-Royce Griffon, 2,000 horsepower, 450 miles an hour. But that was really the limit of what could be achieved in a propeller-driven aircraft. And by the end of the war, the first jets were coming into service. The Meteor was the first jet fighter, and from then on, the RAF only used jet fighters. But the Spitfire continued to be used by foreign air forces right up to the mid-1950s. There were, although it was developed as a fighter, they developed a version. They stripped all the guns out of it, fitted it with cameras, and sent it off as a photographic reconnaissance plane. And without the guns, without the weight of the guns, it was very fast. It was so fast it could outrun any German fighters that tried to chase it. So that was one variation. Another variation was when they put a second cockpit behind the pilot, so that it became a trainer, a pilot, the instructor and pupil sitting one behind the other. And this is where I come into the story, because once these planes had become obsolete, they were bought up by wealthy people who realized that they could charge very large amounts of money for people who wanted to fly the Spitfire. And for nerds like me, this was, a golden opportunity to fulfill my dream. So here I am. I decided that for my 75th birthday, whilst I could still climb aboard a Spitfire, I would have my flight. And this was at Biggin Hill, which was one of the most famous fighter stations of the Second World War, now a civilian airport. But in one corner, they have what's called the Heritage Hangar, and that's where they restore these wonderful old aircraft and keep them flying. I have to say, it cost me an eye-watering amount of money. I hardly dare tell you. It's £2,750 for a half-hour flight. And I know. Pardon? Half an hour. £100 a minute, I know you're thinking, I'm absolutely bonkers, but two reasons why I can justify it. One was because this was in 2021, and the previous year I'd had two holidays cancelled, which would have amounted to more than the cost of the flight. And secondly, I think it's really important to keep these old planes flying, not just in museums. And it's enormously expensive because there's no factories producing parts anymore. They've long since gone. And all the parts have to be sourced from all over the world. And it is very, very expensive. I'm quite happy to part with the best part of £3,000 to keep them going. I've lost my place now. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, here we go again. Right. So, this was on the 7th of August, 2021. But unfortunately, I was talking about good summers in the past. Unfortunately, it was pouring with rain that morning, and the rain was due to last all day. And I'd gone there with my son, and other members of my family were coming and joining us. I thought this isn't going to happen. And I was so disappointed. I can't tell you how disappointed I was. However, we sat in the waiting room, and then a man came in and said, just in the weather forecast, there's a clear window of 2 hours this afternoon, so hopefully we'll get you all in the air. There were two other chaps who'd booked for the morning, so they had to go first. And I was really thinking, this isn't going to happen, this isn't going to happen. Kept looking out the window, any sign of cloud. And finally, they handed me the flying suit and said, put this on. And so, oh, great, I'm going to go. And I met my pilot, who was a Dutch lady called Anna. And off we went. There's me standing, my Spitfire, outside the Heritage Hangar. And there I am being strapped in. By the way, the black and white stripes were what they painted on all the aircraft for D-Day, because to avoid our planes getting shot down by our own people, because some of the anti-aircraft gunners, particularly the Americans, tended to, their aircraft recognition wasn't very good, and we didn't want to lose planes to so-called friendly fire, so that's what the stripes were for. Anyway, I was strapped in, and waving to my family, and then taxiing out, and finally we're in the air. And even with the extra cockpit on, it still looks a beautiful aeroplane. I'm going to show you a short video at the end about what the flight was like. But I just felt this feeling of unreality. You know, this is a real Spitfire. This isn't a mock-up. This isn't a reproduction. This is an actual Spitfire that flew in the war, shot down enemy aircraft, and I'm flying in one. And it was a wonderful feeling. And there, you can see my face says it all, doesn't it? Yeah. By the way, that red thing by my left hand there, that was a hammer thing, because if the cockpit didn't open, you could smash it with that. Well, that was a theory anyway. Luckily, I didn't have to use it. I did have to wear a parachute, civil aviation regulations, and they told me what to do if I had to bail out. Lift the seat up, undo the straps, and then open the cockpit. Pilot would turn it upside down, and out I would fall. They didn't tell me how to land without breaking my legs, because it's like jumping off a 15-foot wall. And of course, parachutists, they roll when they hit the ground to absorb the impact. But they didn't tell us that. And here I am after with Anna, and here I am with members of my family. It was starting to rain now, we're just in time. Anna said as we were coming to land, she said, it's starting to rain. I said, I don't care now. That's me looking at a picture of the aircraft in the war. That was taken in 1944 with the pilot officer Bregman, Canadian pilot, and he had just shot down an MU-109. So that plane really did fly in the war. This is in the Heritage hangar. These are some of the aircraft being worked on. And here are a few more. And there's an MU-109 in full wartime markings. Next to it is a Hurricane, and then furthest away is another Spitfire there, and there is a Spitfire in American markings. And that's the end of that was my dream come true. But I'm going to now attempt to show you, if you'll bear with me a minute while I switch around, a short video. The flight was filmed. There was a little camera inside the cockpit, which was facing backwards. It's a 30-minute video, but I'm only going to subject you to 4 minutes of it, because you have to look at my face for most of the time. So I want you to do that. Family. I'm actually flying the plane at this point. I'm in control. Doing a very slow right-hand turn. We're about to do a roll. So weird sensation above your head. And again. We're coming into land now. You can see it's getting a bit darker, the clouds are building up. Perfect 3-point landing, lovely and smooth. And here we are back at the hangar now. This man is going to the numerous rounds.
You think I'll make a Spitfire pilot?
You had the right.
You can't hear what she says. We're talking through the intercom.
Thank you.
She said something nice anyway.
How many hours have you done on Spitfires? Yeah.
I think she said about 700.
No. Yeah. I thought you were pretty good, actually.
The first round is together and you have to make games for it.
Just waiting for the steps to arrive now to let me out. You can see the rain on the cockpit. It's coming down quite heavily by now.
No. Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Okay.
There we go. We come the steps.
Okay.
Stuck your head for me, Val. Stuck your head for me. Thank you. How are you?
It was all right.
It was all right.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely
No better than all right, eh? Hang on, let's get this lot off here.
I did follow up by saying it was brilliant.
I've just said to your family, just hold fire, don't risk it. It's going to dump itself by the look of it.
Yes.
Let me take them off your mouth.
You know what he said? He doesn't care if the rain.
Just a couple of things I want to say in conclusion. First of all, I'd like to thank Jeff Henderson. Is he here? Is Jeff here? Oh, okay. Who helped me put the slideshow together, and Lawrence, who helped me to edit the half hour down to those few minutes. So my sincere thanks to those two, because I have no technical skill whatsoever. But I want to finish on a more serious note, because however much we may love planes like the Spitfire and love to see them flying and so on, but we need to remember what they were built for. They were weapons of war. They were killing machines, and they killed thousands, and thousands were killed flying them. It's one of the tragedies of human nature that from time to time we feel the need to go to war and kill each other. But if you have to do that, you need the very best weapons, and the Spitfire and the Hurricane were the very best aircraft in the world. And without them, if we lost the Battle of Britain, if Germany had been able to invade us in 1940, we could still be under German control now, because who would have come to rescue us? The Russians, maybe, but then we'd have ended up as part of the Soviet Union, which was just as bad. So, we've got to be thankful to these wonderful aircraft and for the brave young men who flew them, that we can enjoy the freedom that we have today. Thank you very much.